In the winter of 1811, the heart of America didn't just shake, it broke. Deep beneath the mud of the Mississippi, a sleeping giant roared. For 4 months the earth liquefied, forests were swallowed whole, and the mighty Mississippi River, the lifeblood of a continent, turned its back on the sea and flowed north. This is not a myth. This is the winter the stars fell and the earth screamed. Chapter 1. The Portents. The air in New Madrid, Missouri territory was too still. Silas Thorne, a flatboatman with skin like cured leather, felt it in his marrow. It was December 15th, 1811. In the American West, the rumors were already spreading. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh had predicted a sign, a stamping of his foot that would shake the world. To the settlers, it was frontier superstition. To Silas, watching the strange purple hue of the sunset over the river, it felt like a warning. Animals were the first to know. Thousands of squirrels were seen migrating south, drowning themselves by the hundreds as they tried to cross the river in a frantic, suicidal rush. Dogs howled at nothing. The birds had gone silent. "Something's coming, Silas," his younger brother Elias whispered from the deck of their flatboat, which was loaded with flour and whiskey destined for New Orleans. "Just the cold, boy," Silas lied, but he gripped his oar tighter. Chapter 2. The Night the World Ended. At 2:15 a.m. on December 16th, the first shock hit. It wasn't a tremor, it was an explosion from the bowels of the earth. The sound was described by survivors as a mixture of distant thunder and the screaming of 1,000 steam engines. Silas was thrown from his cot as the riverbed beneath their boat heaved. In the darkness, the horror was magnified. Geysers of black coal, sand, and sulfuric water, now known as sand blows, shot 30 feet into the air, smelling of rotting eggs and death. The ground didn't just shake, it moved in waves like a stormy sea. Giant fissures, miles long, yawned open in the earth, swallowing cattle and cabins. "The river!" Elias screamed. Silas looked out. The Mississippi, usually a steady southward giant, was churning in a violent maelstrom. A massive landslide upstream had created a temporary dam, and the resulting backsurge forced the current to reverse. For several terrifying hours, the river flowed north, carrying the wreckage of the frontier with it. Chapter 3. The Ghost of New Madrid. By daybreak, the town of New Madrid was gone. Not destroyed, submerged. The land had dropped 15 feet in a matter of hours. Silas and Elias managed to tie their boat to a half-sunken cottonwood tree. Around them, the landscape was unrecognizable. Islands they had navigated for years had simply vanished. New lakes, like Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, were being formed at that very moment as the forest floor sank and the river rushed in to fill the void. The survivors gathered on the high bluffs, their faces ghost white with earth dust. They believed the world was ending. This was the year of the comets, the year of Tecumseh's prophecy, and now the year the earth became liquid. Chapter 4. The Aftershocks and the Mission. The nightmare didn't end with one quake. Over the next 3 months, over 2,000 aftershocks rattled the mid-continent. 2 more great quakes followed in January and February, the last one being so powerful that it rang church bells in Boston and woke up Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. Silas and Elias realized they couldn't stay. They had to navigate a river that no longer had a map. The graveyard of ships had been created overnight. Hidden snags, new rapids, and the constant threat of the earth opening beneath them turned their journey into an odyssey of survival. Along the way, they encountered the Prophet, a follower of Tecumseh who claimed the white man's greed had awakened the great horned serpent. The refugees, families wandering the woods, terrified to step on solid ground,
some even felling trees to sit across them so they wouldn't fall into the fissures. The science. For the modern reader, we now know these were intraplate earthquakes caused by the Reelfoot Rift, a failed continental breakup from 750 million years ago. Chapter 6. The Steam Demon and the Churn. The month of January 2012 brought a cold that seemed to freeze the very soul. But for Silas and Elias, the cold was the least of their worries. The river had become a labyrinth of death. Massive sawyers, giant trees uprooted by the quakes, bobbed in the current like the spears of giants, capable of piercing a flatboat's hull in a heartbeat. It was during this harrowing transit past the ruins of Island Number 10 that they saw it, a black plume of smoke rising against the gray winter sky. "Is the woods on fire?" Elias asked, squinting through the mist. "No," Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "That's the New Orleans." Rounding the bend, they saw the impossible. A massive vessel, fueled by fire and churning the water with great wooden wheels, was battling the same chaotic currents they were. It was the first steamboat to ever attempt the Mississippi, led by Nicholas Roosevelt. To the settlers on the banks, who were already convinced the apocalypse was at hand, the sight of a fire-breathing ship hissed through the sulphurous fog felt like the arrival of a mechanical demon. The brothers watched as the New Orleans struggled. The earthquake had shifted the sandbars so violently that the captain's charts were useless. For a brief moment, the flatboat and the steamboat were side by side. Silas locked eyes with a man on the steamer's deck, Roosevelt himself. In that look, there was a shared recognition. The old world of muscle and wood was dying, and a new, terrifying world of iron and steam was being born amidst the literal shaking of the earth. Chapter 6. The Earth Liquefaction. On January 23rd, the second great bolt struck. Silas and Elias had pulled their boat onto what they thought was solid ground to make repairs. Suddenly, the earth beneath their feet didn't just shake, it turned into a soup. This was liquefaction. One moment, Silas was standing on a grassy bank. The next, he was waist-deep in a cold, muddy slurry as the soil lost its ability to hold weight. "Silas, grab the line!" Elias screamed, throwing a hemp rope from the boat. As Silas fought to pull himself out of the liquefying earth, he witnessed a horror that would haunt his dreams for decades. A few yards away, a stand of ancient oaks simply sank. They didn't fall over, they were swallowed vertically into the earth, their topmost branches disappearing beneath the mud like drowning fingers. The air turned thick with the smell of prehistoric rot, peat and methane released from pockets deep underground. When the shaking stopped, the landscape had been rewritten. Where a hill had stood, there was now a hollow. Where a path had been, there was a steaming fissure. Chapter 7. The Prophet's Shadow. They encountered a camp of Shawnee survivors a week later. Among them was a man who didn't fear the quakes. He sat by a fire, watching the tremors rattle the cooking pots with a grim smile. "The Great Spirit is treading the earth," the man said in broken English. He told them of Tecumseh, the great leader who had traveled the South warning the tribes that the white man's expansion had upset the balance of the world. He had promised a sign, a day when the sun would go dark and the earth would tremble. "You build your houses of stone and heavy log," he pointed to the ruins of a settler's cabin nearby. "The earth hates the weight. We build of skin and pole. We move with the earth. You fight it. That is why you die." Silas looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from trying to tame the river. For the first time, he wondered if the progress he was a part of, the whiskey, the flour, the trade, was exactly what had provoked the ground to scream. Chapter 8. The Hard Shaking. The climax of their journey approached in early February. The tremors had become a constant vibration, a low-frequency hum that made the brothers' teeth ache.
They reached the Chickasaw Bluffs near what would one day be Memphis. On February 7th,
They passed a village where the entire town had been tilted at a 45-degree angle, the residents clinging to the sides of their homes as if hanging off a cliff. Chapter 9. The Sunken Forest. The landscape was no longer the America Silas knew. By mid-February, they had drifted into a region that felt like a fever dream. The earthquake had caused a massive subsidence, the land had simply dropped away, and the Mississippi had rushed in to claim it. They found themselves drifting into Real Foot, a place where the map ended. Here the water was eerily clear, and beneath the surface of their boat they could see the tops of giant cypress trees, still standing upright, but now 10 feet underwater. "It's a graveyard of trees," Elias whispered, staring into the depths. It was silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. The birds had stayed away from this drowned land. As they navigated their flatboat through the sunken forest, the branches of dead trees scraped against the hull like skeleton fingers. Suddenly, a massive tremor, a late aftershock, rippled through the water. The submerged trees began to sway, and the water around them started to boil with gas bubbles from the rotting vegetation below. They weren't alone. Stuck on a small mound of earth that was rapidly eroding into the new lake was a family of settlers. They were huddled together, clutching Bibles and axes. "Don't land there," Silas shouted. "The ground is liquid." He was too late. As they watched, a fissure opened right through the middle of the family's makeshift camp. There was no fire, no lava, just a silent, gaping maw in the mud. The mother screamed as her trunk of belongings vanished into the crack. Silas steered the boat close to the edge, risking the haul against the submerged snags, and hauled the youngest child aboard just as the bank gave way. Chapter 10. The Madness of the Frontier. By the time they reached the southern reaches of the Missouri Territory, the earthquake malady had taken hold of the survivors they encountered. People were living in a state of perpetual terror. In a small clearing near the riverbank, they found a group that had completely broken. They were led by a man named Preacher Jedediah, whose eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. They had felled several large walnut trees and were sitting straddled across the trunks. "Why are you sitting like that?" Elias asked, as they pulled the boat in to trade for fresh water. "The cracks, boy," Jedediah hissed. "The earth opens and shuts like the mouth of a beast. If you sit on a tree and the earth opens beneath you, the tree will bridge the gap. It's the only way to stay out of hell." These people were terrified to stand on the ground. They had built earthquake cabins, tiny light shacks made of thin poles that wouldn't crush them if they collapsed. But the psychological damage was deeper. They had started a ritual of stamping out the devil. Every hour they would stand and stomp their feet in unison, believing that if they shook the earth themselves, the earth wouldn't need to shake them. The sound of 50 people stomping in rhythm on the hollow, unstable ground was more haunting than the quakes themselves. Silas realized then that the land wasn't the only thing that had broken. The American spirit of the frontier was fracturing under the weight of the unknown. Chapter 11. The Waterfall of the West. The greatest challenge lay at the Narrows. The February 7th quake had created a massive vertical fault across the riverbed. As Silas and Elias approached, they heard a roar that sounded like 1,000 lions. "There's a drop-off," Silas yelled, grabbing the heavy steering oar. The mighty Mississippi, the highway of the continent, had become a waterfall. The uplift of the Real Foot Fault had created a temporary cataract nearly 6 feet high. For a flatboat, it was a death sentence. "We have to jump it," Elias cried, white-knuckled as he gripped the side of the boat. "Aim for the center. Keep her straight or we'll capsize." The boat accelerated. The water was a chaotic mess of brown foam and earthquake wood, debris that had been buried for centuries and spat back up by the riverbed. As they hit the crest of the falls, the boat hovered for a heart-stopping second in the air. Crack! The hull slammed into the lower current. Water poured over the sides, soaking their precious flour and whiskey. But they were upright.
They had survived the waterfall of the Mississippi, a geological anomaly that would disappear within weeks as the powerful current eroded the soft silt of the fault line. Chapter 12. The Vultures of the Wreckage. The river was a graveyard, and where there are graves, there are ghouls. By late February, the brothers were starving. Their flour was damp and molding, and their whiskey, once a fortune, was being traded ounce by ounce for clean water. As they drifted past the ruins of Stack Island, a notorious haunt for outlaws, they saw a signal fire from the fog. "Help us, in the name of God!" a woman's voice cried from the fog. Elias instinctively reached for the oar to steer toward the bank, but Silas slammed his hand down on his brother's shoulder. "Wait!" Silas hissed. He pointed his long rifle toward the brush behind the woman. The earthquake dust usually settled white on everything, but there were dark shapes moving there that weren't covered in dust. Suddenly, 3 skiffs shot out from the willows. These weren't survivors, they were the river pirates of the Mississippi. Leading them was a man known in frontier legends as Colonel Pfluger, a deserter and a butcher who saw the quakes as a gift from the devil. To Pfluger, the chaos was a great reset. No laws, no sheriffs, just the strong taking from the terrified. "Surrender the boat and the whiskey, and we might let you walk the mud," Pfluger roared, standing in the prow of the lead skiff with a blunderbuss leveled at them. "The mud is liquid, you fool," Silas shouted back. "You'll sink before you reach us." The river chose that moment to intervene. A massive sand blow exploded just 20 yards from the pirate skiffs. A column of black water and coal shale erupted from the riverbed, with the force of a cannon, tossing Pfluger's lead boat into the air like a splinter. The pirates scrambled as the water turned into a whirlpool of sulfurous sludge. Silas didn't wait. He pushed the oar with every ounce of his strength, catching the swiftest part of the current to escape the vultures. Chapter 13. The Strange Lights and the Sky of Fire. That night, as they drifted into the Chickasaw Bluffs, the brothers witnessed a phenomenon that would baffle scientists for 2 centuries: earthquake lights. The sky was pitch black, but the ground began to glow. Faint, ghostly streaks of blue and purple light flickered across the horizon. Some survivors thought it was the aurora borealis. Others thought it was the fire of hell leaking through the cracks. "Silas, is the air burning?" Elias coughed. The smell of sulfur was so thick it burned their lungs. They weren't just seeing things. The tectonic stress was so immense that it was squeezing the quartz in the Earth's crust, creating an electrical discharge that lit up the night. It was a beautiful, terrifying spectacle. Beneath the lights, the river looked like a ribbon of silver, but the sound remained, a low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump from the depths of the earth, like a giant heart beating beneath the mud. Chapter 14. The First Relief. By the time they reached the port of Natchez under the hill, they were skeleton versions of themselves. Natchez sat high on a bluff, making it one of the few places that hadn't been swallowed. Here, Silas saw the first sparks of what would become the American spirit of resilience. Men were organizing search and succor parties. They weren't just looking for kin, they were looking for anyone who had survived the shaking lands. It was here that Silas met John Bradbury, the English naturalist. While everyone else was praying or drinking themselves into a stupor, Bradbury was calmly measuring the fissures with a weighted string. "Do you realize what you've lived through, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, scribbling in his wet leather notebook. "The energy released in the February shock, it's equivalent to thousands of tons of gunpowder. This isn't just a local tremor, this is a continental shift. The very center of this new nation has been reforged." Bradbury told them the news from the east. The quakes had been felt in the White House. People in South Carolina had been thrown from their beds. In Richmond, Virginia, the earth had groaned so loud that people thought the British had returned with heavy cannons. Chapter 15. The Paper Trail of Greed. As the shaking began to subside in the spring of 1812, a new kind of disaster began: the land scams. The government in Washington, D.C., realizing that thousands of settlers had lost their farms to the new lakes and fissures, passed the new Madrid Relief Act. It allowed anyone whose land was damaged to swap their title for new land elsewhere in the public domain. Silas soon learned that the land sharks were moving faster than the river. Speculators were buying up damaged land titles from traumatized survivors for pennies, then using those titles to claim the richest parts of Missouri and Illinois. "They're stealing the ground out from under us twice, Elias," Silas said, looking at a crumpled deed for their family farm in New Madrid, a farm that now sat at the bottom of a swamp. Silas made a vow. He wouldn't just survive the river, he would survive the recovery. He began the long trek toward the capital of the territory, not with an oar, but with a legal claim, ready to fight the lawyers with the same grit he used to fight the waterfall of the Mississippi.